So, if you're a sports fan, there are certain moments that you never forget. So, for me, like today, most of my sports watching has been reduced to games involving my three boys. So, if you want to talk about T-ball, coach's pitch, or the local kind of junior pro basketball scene, I'm your guy. But before that, there were a lot of things that I witnessed that I'll never forget. And you have them too. It's that last second shot in the tournament to send your team to the next round. It's that, game-saving deflection in a football game that allows your team to steal a victory. It's that hit that comes with 2 outs and 2 on in the bottom of the ninth and drives in that game-winning run. Those are the things that once you see them, like, you never forget them. Even years later, you can recall the details. For me, one of those moments happened on June 28th, 1997. It's hard to believe it's been over 25 years, but if you witnessed what I witnessed that night, I'm almost certain that you've never forgotten it. It was a Saturday night. I was a 14-year-old freshman in high school, and some friends of mine came over to the house, and we got together with my pop to watch Evander Holyfield fight Mike Tyson. Now, boxing was kind of the only thing my grandpa would spend money on. He was an old school kind of boxing enthusiast, so whenever there was a big fight, we would get it. So we all gathered in the living room. We're watching this fight, and if you remember, 7 months before, Holyfield had defeated Mike Tyson in what was considered one of the biggest upsets in boxing history. Just totally dominated the fight. Unfortunately for Tyson, the second fight picked up where the first fight left off, and for the first 3 rounds, Holyfield was just sort of giving him the business, working him over. That is until 40 seconds to go in the 3rd round when something absolutely bonkers happened. Tyson tied up Holyfield. What I mean by that, he grabbed his arms and he bit a 1-inch chunk out of the top of Holyfield's right ear. If you remember, it was pandemonium. The referee of the fight was a guy named Mills Lane, who later became a cable TV judge. So if you're a person who watches all that stuff in the afternoon, Mills Lane was there. Almost unbelievably, after stopping the fight, cleaning up Holyfield's ear, Mills Lane talked to the ringside doctor, and they decided for some reason to allow the fight to continue. Of course, a lot of money on the line, rather than disqualify Tyson. So they got both fighters back in the middle of the ring. They touched gloves, and almost immediately, Tyson tied him up again. And this time, if you remember, he bit him on the left ear. Now, I'm not going to show you the picture of the ear because it's before lunch, but I do want to show you a picture of what happened right after that. You can see Holyfield feeling with his glove to make sure that his ear is still attached to his head. Now, if you saw that night, I'm almost certain that you've never forgotten it, because it's one of those moments that once you see it, you never forget it. Today it's known as the bite fight, which is accurate. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to John 18. For the last few weeks, we've been in this series in which we've been looking at the final week of Jesus' life on earth, and by the time you get to Thursday of that final week, the events speed up so much that it's almost impossible to keep up with everything that's happening. As best we can tell, at some point on Thursday morning, Jesus' disciples went into Jerusalem as they'd done the previous days. They went to the temple, and Jesus then spent most of the day inside the temple complex, answering questions, telling stories, and teaching the people who had assembled there. When the evening came, though, rather than leaving the city like they'd done before and going back to the little village of Bethany, which was located outside of Jerusalem, they stayed inside the city limits. And the reason they did that is, according to tradition, the Passover meal, which is what everybody was there to celebrate, had to be celebrated inside the city. And so rather than leaving the city, they stayed. One of the things that can sometimes trip you up, though, whenever you try to recreate the timeline, is from a Jewish perspective, a new day starts at sunset. So like for us, we would say, hey, tomorrow morning will be the start of a new day. For a Jewish person, at least historically, the new day would start as the sun goes down. And so as Thursday turns into Friday at sunset, there are a lot of things that happen, just boom, 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 that are all significant, but are hard to sort of wrap your mind around. First, they go to this upper room where they celebrate the Passover together, and as a part of that, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. Remember that. Then he institutes what we call the Lord's Supper or communion. He reenacts that. They celebrate the Passover together, and then when that's over, he predicts that one of his disciples is going to betray him. All of them are going to abandon him, and then he delivers what's called his farewell discourse. You can read all through the Gospel of John if you want to catch up on that. From there, once the meal is over, Jesus and his disciples, they leave the upper room. They travel through the city to the eastern side of the city, where they go to this garden that's located at the bottom of the Mount of Olives called the Garden of Gethsemane. I've got a picture of what it looks like. So if you were to travel to Jerusalem today, you could actually go and hang out in the place where the story we're getting ready to read actually happened. While they were there, the gospel writers tell us that Jesus spends some time praying. He's trying to prepare himself emotionally and spiritually for what's about to happen to him. Nobody else seems to realize what's happening, but Jesus knows. In fact, at one point it got so intense during his little prayer meeting that it says he actually sweat drops of blood, which tells you where he was emotionally and spiritually. Later that night, sometime after midnight, so late Thursday night, early Friday morning, however you want to count it, is where we pick up the story in verse 1 of John 18. The way John tells the story, it's right after Jesus finishes praying that his old friend Judas shows up, and this time he's brought with him a detachment of Roman soldiers along with some temple policemen. John 18, verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priest and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. I almost titled this, When a SWAT Team Shows Up at Prayer Meeting. Like, this is Jesus out here in this garden. He's trying to prepare himself spiritually. All of a sudden, here comes Judas, and he's got this detachment of Roman soldiers. And the word that John uses for detachment indicates it was at least 200, maybe up to 600 soldiers, along with these policemen who work for the Jewish religious leadership. And they're all armed to the teeth, ready for a potentially violent confrontation. In their mind, they're coming to arrest not a religious teacher, but a political revolutionary who's threatening to overturn the government. And so that when they show up after the events of the previous week, they are understandably on high alert. Like, they are ready for a fight. If this is going to be the final showdown, they're going to bring this overwhelming force and eliminate Jesus. But then you get to verse 4, and there's this incredible shift that takes place in which Jesus steps to the forefront, and he sort of takes over the entire scene. As you unpack this story, there were several people involved in the events that happened in the Garden of Gethsemane that night. And for each of them, what happened on that late Thursday night, early Friday morning, became something that they thought about and talked about for the rest of their lives. I mean, this was something that they never forgot. It was a truly unforgettable moment. And honestly, this kind of story, we could spend several weeks and really several hours just talking about what happened in this particular scene on that night. But for our purposes this morning, I just want to point you to one group of people and two individuals and talk about what they learned from what they experienced that night. The first person I want us to look at is Peter. And the lesson that Peter learned that night is that Jesus is always in control, especially when things feel out of control. Check out verse 4. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went ahead and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. Now you read the other Gospels, this is the point where Judas comes up and he kisses Jesus as a symbol to the soldiers. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. Now check out this part, verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it back and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? To me, this has always been like one of the most overlooked but most captivating parts of the Easter drama. All four gospel writers mention this incident that happened between Peter and the high priest's servant Malchus. What's interesting, they all sort of focus on different details, but when you put those stories together, you realize that Peter is in a panic. A few hours earlier, during the Last Supper, Peter had made this promise to Jesus that no matter what happened and no matter what anybody else did, he would never run away. He would never abandon him. Matthew 26 puts it like this. Peter replied, even if all fall away on account of you, I never will. You ever done something you said you'd never do? Truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. But again, Peter declared, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples said the same. Now, if you know the rest of the story, you know Jesus' prediction turns out to be accurate. Peter does indeed deny him 3 times. But as the soldiers stormed into that garden on that late Thursday night, early Friday morning, Peter's promise to never abandon Jesus is still weighing heavy on his mind. And so he does something that makes no sense for him to do. It says he pulls out his sword and he tries to pick a fight with at least 200 and maybe 600 soldiers. And keep in mind, Peter's not like Chuck Norris, right? He's not James Bond. He's not, Bruce Willis from the Die Hard movies. Peter's just a dude. Peter is a fisherman. It's not like Peter has, some magical swordsmanship. He doesn't have any of that. He's just in a moment of panic. He doesn't know what to do. So he pulls out his sword and he potentially makes a bad situation much worse. Because as things are spiraling out of control around him, he decides he's going to take it upon himself to try and regain some control. And unsurprisingly, he messes it up. One of the things that I've always found interesting about this story is that if you go back, John and the other 3 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all mention that it was Malchus's right ear that got cut off. Now, assuming that Peter was right-handed, that creates some problems in terms of like the angle of attack, unless you start with the assumption that Peter was not aiming for his ear. Here's what I mean by that. Some of you have seen that old movie, Zorro, about that masked vigilante. He comes in, he kind of, carve you up. He can kind of do whatever he wants to do. Remember, that's not Peter. Peter's just a dude. So the assumption would be that Peter is panicked. He's angry. He doesn't know what to do. The adrenaline's pumping. So he pulls out that sword, and most likely he's aiming for the neck. But he misses so badly that he cuts off a guy's ear. And everybody sits back, and they're looking at that. And here's Peter, and in this moment of panic, he's aiming for the throat of his perceived enemy, and he winds up cutting off his ear. Now compare the panic of Peter to the calmness of Jesus all throughout this scene. One writer said, Jesus has absolute mastery in this moment. I have the suspicion that his pulse is the steadiest and the slowest one there. Jesus sees what's happening. The disciples are panicked. Peter's trying to pick a fight that's certainly going to end in his death. And Jesus interrupts the proceeding, if you know the rest of the story, and he says something to Peter that lets Peter know that he was not taken by surprise by any of this. Matthew 26, verse 53, Jesus says, do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels. But how then would the scripture be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? Now, assuming that there really are an entire detachment, 600 Roman soldiers, a legion of soldiers was 6,000. So if Jesus calls in 12 legions of 6,000, 72,000 soldiers, there's going to be no match for these Roman soldiers. The Romans are going to have no chance of this. But Jesus doesn't do that. And there's a lot we can learn from that. But for now, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that even when it looks like everything is spiraling out of control, Jesus is in perfect control. There's nothing that happened that night that took him by surprise. There's nothing that happened out his entire life. There's nothing that's happened in your life that's ever taken him by surprise. There's never been a moment when Jesus was kind of looking at you and wringing his hands and has no idea what to do and how to solve your problem. There's never been a moment when his pulse quickened and he panicked thinking, what am I going to do? In every single moment throughout his life and your life, he's always in perfect control. The problem is, though, sometimes we're a lot like Peter, right? We panic. We see what's right in front of us. We're not sure what to do. And we know we should trust Jesus to solve it, but we're not sure how that works. So we like to swing our sword, right? We pull that sword out and we start sort of cutting away. And what happens? We make a bigger mess than needed to be. And then Jesus has to come in and clean it up anyway. How much better would it be, or think about this, how much better would your life be if instead of you wildly swinging your sword around, you just trusted Jesus to solve your biggest issues? To do for you what you could never do for yourself anyway. Do you think that would work better? Seems to work better in this story. The second group of people that I want you to look at are the disciples. And what they learned during this encounter was something that, again, all of us forget, and that's that Jesus is my substitute. Now, the reason the Roman soldiers are involved in this scene at all is because they viewed Jesus as a political rival to the emperor. So their primary concern is not religious. They don't care anything about the religious aspect of this. They're more concerned about the politics of this. By this point, the Roman Empire had expanded. It was a massive size. I've got a picture I want to show you that kind of shows you where you can see the red parts. So you've got this empire that takes up most of Europe. And so whenever you've got that, their number one concern is they don't want anybody anywhere in that empire, any sort of political rival, to gain enough traction to push back against the emperor's authority. And so because of the size of the empire and because of the political environment of the first century, this was something they dealt with all the time. Like the Romans were masters at stamping out dissent. And here's how they did it. And over time, it was ruthlessly effective. Here's what they did. Wherever there was a political rival, they would crucify the rival and arrest the followers. Another rival pops up, we'll crucify that guy, and we'll arrest the followers. And over time, as I said, it was a ruthlessly effective way to do it. So make sure you understand, when the Romans showed up that night in the Garden of Gethsemane, along with the Jewish religious leaders, their plan is to arrest Jesus and his followers. Like they didn't come just to get one or two of them, they came to get all of them. That's what makes what Jesus does when they arrive so powerful. Once you go back to verse 4 with me. It says, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out and asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. Now check out this part. I am he, Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Now in sports, especially right now during the tournament, there's a popular catchphrase. Somebody will hit a big shot and they'll pump their chest and they'll say, I am him. Well, Jesus really was him. And that's what he's saying. And the fact, if you look at this in Greek, the word he is not in there. It's the translators added that for readability. He really says, I am. Listen, who is it you want? They say Jesus, and he says, I am. It's the Greek phrase, Ego Eimi. And the reason that sounds familiar to you, if you go back to Exodus 3, that was the name that God gave Moses when Moses came and said, when I go to Pharaoh, who is it that you want me to tell him sent me? And God says, my name is I am. And so if you remember the story in Exodus, that was the encounter with God. That was the conversation with God that launched the chain reaction of events that eventually led to the Passover. Fast forward 1,200 years into the future, 200, maybe 250,000 people are in Jerusalem to celebrate and remember the Passover. And what's Jesus saying to them? He's telling them that the same God who spoke to Moses out of that burning bush in Exodus 3 that they're all there to celebrate is now standing right in front of them. That's why it says at the end of verse 6 that as soon as he said it, these battle-hardened elite soldiers fell to the ground. Why did they fall down? They fell because they realized that they were standing in the presence of a person, of a power that eclipsed anything they'd ever seen before. He was bigger than the temple. He was bigger than the Jewish religion. He was even more powerful than the Roman Empire. And then you get to verse 7, and Jesus does something that's so important to understand. Verse 7. Again, he asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. Now keep in mind, when the Romans stormed into that garden, late Thursday night, early Friday morning, they came with the intention of arresting Jesus and his followers. And so when Jesus steps forward, he says, hey, here's what I'll do. I'll go with you willingly if you let these guys go. And he becomes their substitute. He sacrifices his security for their safety. He's willing to give up his life so that his friends can go free. It's a foreshadowing of what he'll do a few hours later when he goes to the cross and he took the punishment for their sins and our sins so that we could go free. Romans 3:25, Paul explained it like this. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Christ. Because of God's holiness, he can't just overlook our sin. There has to be a penalty that's paid. But because of his love, his son steps forward and says, hey, I will pay the penalty. I'll pay the price. You can take me if you'll let them go free. And that's so important to remember. Did you know that when Jesus went to the cross, he was not going as a victim? A lot of people read this story, they say Jesus is kind of this victim of injustice. That's not true. And one of the things I hope you're starting to sink in as you read through the events of that final week is that at any point during this week, Jesus could have stopped this. Like he could have said no more, but he willingly chose to go to the cross not as a victim of injustice, but as a substitute for his friends. He took what we deserved so that we could go free. Now, the last person that I want you to focus on, this unfolding drama, is a guy named Caiaphas. And the lesson that Caiaphas learned is that Jesus' love extends even to his enemies. So you read this part of the story. Caiaphas is not mentioned until you get to verse 12, but it's clear throughout the final week of Jesus' life on earth that it's Caiaphas who's the guy, he's the man behind the curtain, pulling all the strings, pushing all the levers to orchestrate what's going to happen to Jesus. Look at verse 12 with me. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So you go back and you read Jewish history from the first century. Caiaphas was a major player. He was a political player, a religious player. He was the Jewish high priest, which is kind of like being the Jewish pope from 18 AD to 36 AD. And keep in mind that because of his position, Caiaphas was charged with overseeing most of what Jesus disrupted over that final week. So, for example, when Jesus went to the temple on Monday, remember, he overturned the tables of the money changers. He ran out the people who were extorting the pilgrims who had come there to worship. Most of that money, or at least a good percentage of that money, eventually wound up in Caiaphas' account. And so when Jesus comes in, that costs Caiaphas money. So all throughout this week, Caiaphas has been waiting for the perfect opportunity to eliminate a rival without causing a riot. And on this particular night, Judas shows up, and he tells Caiaphas exactly where Jesus is going to be, and he sees his opportunity. So as best we can tell, it was Caiaphas who orchestrated the arrest of Jesus. And one of the reasons we think that is because of something that John mentioned back in verse 10. We're going to put this on the screen just so you don't miss it. Here's what it says. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, and he struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. That servant's name was Malchus. So Caiaphas is the high priest, but you got to remember, a guy in his position has more than one servant, right? He's got he's got a whole army of servants. But one of the things interesting, the way that John words this, and the other three gospel writers all back this up, is he doesn't say he struck one of the high priests. They always use the definite article the, which seems to indicate that Malchus is more than just a servant. He is the servant. He is like the right-hand man to the high priest. You might think of him as the chief of staff to the high priest. And so that means the reason Malchus was there that night is because Caiaphas sent him. He wanted him to oversee what was happening and then report back to him on how it all went down. In Luke's telling of this story, Luke 22, though, he adds one detail that changes sort of the whole tenor of the story that John, for some reason, doesn't mention, but Luke does. And here's what he says. And one of them, meaning Peter, struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, no more of this. Now make sure you catch this part. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Just for a second, try and put yourself in Malchus' shoes. At some point early Friday morning, long after the events of that night have passed, Jesus is now in custody. Malchus has to go back to the palace where the high priest lives. And the way I imagine this, he's standing there in Caiaphas' office, and it's time for him to report back to his boss everything that happened during those previous hours. You imagine how that went? Malchus is standing there, and Caiaphas says, well, Malchus, did you get him? And Malchus kind of stands there. He doesn't know what to say. And the way I envision this, he's standing there in front. He's kind of nervous, and he reaches up, and he makes sure his ear's still there. And he says, trying to sound confident, he says, yeah, we got him. Caiaphas says, well, did you have any trouble? Did that big-mouthed fisherman, remember him? Did he cause any trouble? And again, Caiaphas, Malchus has no idea what to say. And he hesitates for a moment. He's trying to formulate his answer. And maybe he even reaches up a second time just to make sure his ear is still there. And this time, not quite so confidently, he says, actually, sir, he did kind of cause some trouble. And that gets Caiaphas' attention, right? He knows he doesn't want any trouble because he knows if there's trouble, like the Romans will come in and take over. So he leans to the edge of his seat, and I kind of imagine him overlooking his desk, looking up at Malchus, and he says, what kind of trouble? Tell me exactly what happened. Tell me everything. And there's Malchus trying to figure out how to put this. And the tension is just so thick, you can barely breathe. And then he looks at his boss. He says, well, I don't know how to tell you this, but that big-mouthed fisherman you mentioned, Peter, he cut my ear off. Caiaphas looks at that, and that doesn't compute, right? So he stands up from his desk, and he walks around, and he gets right in the face of Malchus. And he very slowly examines that ear. And he says, your ear looks okay to me. And Malchus says, I know. And that's the problem. One writer said that Malchus's ear was in many ways God's last love letter to Caiaphas. I want you to listen to these words from Dennis Kinlaw. He said, I suppose on Monday morning, after the crucifixion, Caiaphas, who's been hearing rumors all night long, looks at his servant, and all he can see is Malchus's right ear. Could the man who heals ears conquer death? That question must have flashed through his mind. Malchus's ear is God's last love note to Caiaphas, God's last attempt to save that old high priest through his mercy and grace. From that moment forward, every time he looked at Malchus, he saw Jesus' testimony that when the soldiers came to arrest him and kill him, Jesus could only do them good. I believe that pretty soon Caiaphas transferred Malchus to another position so he no longer had to stare at God's last love note to him. Then he asked this question. He said, do you suppose Malchus became a believer? All I know is that the rest of his days, Malchus bore in his body evidence of Jesus' grace. Do you know God never leaves himself without a witness? You know what I mean by that? You look at Caiaphas, man, even somebody as hard-hearted, as cynical, as corrupt as he was, he's given this opportunity to see firsthand Jesus' love extended even to him. And the same thing is true for us. Make sure you're saying, no matter how far you've drifted, no matter what you've done, no matter how much you've messed it up, that God is always pursuing you. He's always chasing after you. And most of the time, he's sending you one love letter after another, trying to get your attention and bring you back home and communicate his never-ending, overwhelming, reckless love. The problem, though, is that just like Caiaphas, we tend to miss it. Listen again, these words from Dr. Kinlaw. If we miss Christ, it will not be because we have turned down one witness to him. It will be a million signals that we have missed. Our total life is immersed in him, but we are too busy to see. We do not want to take the time or pay the price. We have to listen if we want to hear him, and we have to look if we want to see him. Some of us get so close and miss him because we do not pay attention to his love notes. As Paul said, we will be without excuse on that day, because his divine power and love have been revealed in the creation in a million ways. Back in 2012, writers from Sports Illustrated, they went back and they interviewed everybody who was involved in the Holyfield-Tyson fight, the second one. They called it an oral history of the bite fight. And I don't know why that makes me laugh, but it does. And so if oral history as opposed to written history, you go back and you interview people who were there and you try to get their firsthand recollections. That's what they did. They interviewed both fighters, the trainers, the promoters, the ring announcer, even the ringside doctor. What was interesting, even Tyson himself, 15 years after that event, they were all still trying to process exactly what happened that night. And my suspicion is if you get the same people, at least the ones who are still alive, in a room today, they'd still be trying to figure it out. Nobody quite understood everything that went on. There's a part of me that wishes we could somehow create an oral history of what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane that night. Just bring everybody in and interview them and talk about what they learned and what they saw and sort of get their firsthand recollections. And I'd love to do one where you knew how the story ended for people. And for some of them we do, right? It's like, for example, we know Peter goes on to become a leader in the early church. He's the guy that stands up and preaches on the day of Pentecost. Peter's this great sort of turnaround story. And then we know what happened to the disciples. We know that the remaining disciples spent the rest of their lives carrying the message of the gospel to the known world, and we kind of know what happened to them. We even know what happened to Caiaphas. If you keep reading in Acts, even after the resurrection, it says that Peter and John healed this guy in Acts chapter 4, and it's Caiaphas that's trying to bring him in. He spends the rest of his life pushing against what he knew to be true. But the one that we don't know about is Malchus. Like, we don't know what happened to him. And there's a lot of speculation, and you can look stuff up online, but there's no real factual evidence. So it could be that Malchus thought about it, and then the resurrection happened, and he realized, oh my goodness, this guy was who he said he was, and maybe he became a believer. Or maybe he continued on as an enemy of Christ. Or maybe he did kind of what a lot of us do. Maybe he just kind of stayed in the middle. He kind of lived in this in-between place. And maybe there were moments when he thought, yeah, this all makes sense. And I remember this guy, he showed me his love. He demonstrated his love. And I remember the resurrection. And maybe there were moments when he tended to put his faith in Christ, but then there were other moments when he just couldn't wrap his mind around everything. So he kind of lived his entire life in the middle between being in and being out. That's what a lot of people do. But as interesting as that question is, there's a more important question. And it's not what happened to Malchus. It's what's going to happen to you. I want you to stand with us. We're going to have a time of invitation. If you're here and you need to decide whether you're in or out, or maybe you're coming this morning, you have no relationship at all with Jesus, today could be a moment that you never forget. Today could be a moment that it all changes for you. So here's what I want you to do. If you want to pray with somebody, if you want to talk to somebody, if you have questions about what your next step would be, if you're ready to be baptized into Christ, ready to pray with someone, ready to join the team here at FCC, we're going to sing a couple songs. If at any point during this you feel the Holy Spirit leading you to make a decision, I want you to leave your seat and come up on this front row, and David and I will meet you here.